We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph in Meseches Nedarim. This is Nedarim Daf 42a. The Mishnah says, Hamudar hana mechavero. Let's say a person is prohibited by neder from getting benefit from his friend, lifnei shvius. And this neder took place, it was made before the Shemitah year. So the halacha is, Eino yored l'soch sadeyu. He's not allowed to go into his field. There is an isser even of drisas, a regel going into a person's property. It's considered a benefit. Ve'eino ochel min hanotos. And he's also not allowed to eat even from the produce that is hanging outside of the field. This is talking about even on the Shemitah year. Even on the Shemitah year where that produce is considered hefker. But since the neder was made, since that prohibition was in effect and made before the Shemitah year, so even on the Shemitah year, he can't go into the field and he can't take any of the produce even if it does not involve going into the field. And the Mishnah continues, uvashvias. Now let's say this neder was made on the Shemitah year itself, so then Eino yored l'soch sadeyu. He's still prohibited from going into the person's field because the person made a neder against him that he's not allowed to enter the field. That's still going to be prohibited. But he is allowed to eat from the plants, meaning from the produce that is hanging outside of the field, because since the neder was made during the Shemitah year, and during the Shemitah year the produce is considered hefker, so there's no problem taking from the produce. And the Mishnah continues, Nadar heimenu maichol lifnei shvius. Now let's say the neder has to do only with food, and that was made before the Shemitah year. The neder was made before the Shemitah year, so yored l'soch sadeyu. So in that situation, there is no prohibition from just going into the property, so he is allowed to go into the property. Ve'eno ochel min haperos. However, he's not allowed to eat from the fruits in that situation, again, because since the neder was made before the Shemitah year, so there's a prohibition even during the Shemitah year to eat from the produce, even though the produce is hefker. Uvashvius, but if the neder was made during the Shemitah year, so then there's no prohibition on the produce, and yored v'ochel, he can go down into the person's field and he can eat from the produce. And the Mefarish over here explains, Hamudar hana mechaveru lifnei shvius. Again, a person is mudar hana from his friend's property, and that neder was made before the Shemitah year, meaning shehidiru chaveru, meaning his friend made a neder against him. He said, you're not allowed to get any benefit from me. Kodem shenichnas shvius, and he made that neder against the other individual before the Shemitah year started. So ein yored l'soch sadeyu, he can't go into his field, lechol mipero shvius, even during the Shemitah year, to eat from the fruits of shvius, the aser b'drisas haregel, because there's a general prohibition for this person to get benefit from the other person. Even to go into the property is a problem. He's also not allowed to take from the fruits that are hanging outside of the field. That produce he'd be able to take without entering the field. Now, even though it is produce of Shemitah, he's not allowed to eat from them, like we're going to say in the Gemara. Adam oser davar shebershus, so a person can prohibit something that's within his reshus, within his control. So even when it's no longer in his reshus, even though during the Shemitah year the produce is hefker, but since he made the neder against his friend, he said that his friend cannot get benefit from him, and he made that neder before the Shemitah year. So even during the Shemitah year, when the produce is hefker, the neder still applies. V'hainami here also, kevan delifnei shvius heidiru chaveru. Since before shvius his friend made the neder, said he can't get benefit, so kiyasa nami shvius aser behen. So even during the Shemitah year, it is going to be prohibited. Uvashvius avalim heidiru b'shvius. But if the neder was made during shvius, during the Shemitah year, so still lo yored l'soch sadeyu, he's still not allowed to go into the field. That's a problem again of drisas haregel. Avalo chalum min hanotos, but he is allowed to eat from the hanging fruits. Hoel v'lo have b'reshus, so hashta ki madir leit, because it wasn't in his reshus when he made the neder. It's already Shemitah year. It's considered hefker. Uva Gemara mefarish amay eno yored v'amay ochel ha'aranami de hefker. Now the Gemara is going to explain why is it that he's prohibited from drisas haregel, but in terms of eating it's fine. But the problem is that even drisas haregel, the land itself is considered hefker. So drisas haregel should also be okay over here. Why is there a distinction? The Gemara will explain. Nadar heimenu maichol lifnei shvius. Now let's say the neder was made only in terms of food, and the neder was made before shvius. Avalo nadar heimenu hana. There wasn't a general prohibition of getting benefit. So lechimati shvius. So then when the Shemitah year comes, yored ve'eno ochel. He's allowed to go into the field, but he can't have any of the produce. The halo heidiru element maichol, because again he only made the neder against him in terms of the produce. Avaleno ochel kedeforishas lael. But again he's not allowed to eat the produce, like we said earlier. The adam oser davar shebershuso afilo la'achar sheyetzim mershuso. A person can prohibit something that's in his reshus, and it's going to be prohibited even at the time or even after the time that it leaves his reshus. Uvashvius heidiru b'shvius. Now again, if the neder was made during the Shemitah year, yored va'ochel da'achshav yetzim rishus. So then he's allowed to go in because already now when the neder was made, it's not in his rishus. And the Gemara says, Rav u'Shmuel da'amri tarvayu, Rav and Shmuel, they both say as follows, Nechosim elu alecha lifnei shvius. Let's say a person says this property is going to be prohibited to you, and he makes that neder before shvius. So ein yored l'soch sadeyu, ve'eno ochel min hanotos. He's not allowed to go into his field, and he's not allowed to eat even from the hanging fruit that's hanging outside of the field. Afal pi shehigia shvius. Even though the Shemitah year came, the prohibition is still in effect. V'im b'shvius neder. Now, if the neder was actually made during the Shemitah year, so again, ein yored l'soch sadeyu. He's not allowed to go into his field. The drisas haregel is still going to be prohibited. Avol ochel min hanotos, but there is no prohibition from the food that's hanging outside of the field. He is allowed to eat from that. Again, since the neder was made during the Shemitah year, the meichel is going to be permitted because it is hefker. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish da'amri tarvayu, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, they both say, nechasai alecha lifnei shvius. Let's say the person says, my property is prohibited to you, and he makes the neder before shvius. So then, ein yored l'soch sadeyu. He's not allowed to go into his field. Ve'en ochel min hanotos. And again, he's not allowed to eat from the notos, from the hanging fruit. But higia shvius. But let's say shvius arrives, so meaning this is all before the Shemitah year. But once the Shemitah year comes, so eino yored l'soch sadeyu, he still cannot go into his field. Avol ochelhu es hanotos. But he is allowed to eat from the hanging fruit. Meaning, according to Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, even though the neder was made before the Shemitah year, once the Shemitah year arrives, everything is going to be hefker. In terms of the food, it's going to be hefker, and the food will be permitted. And the Gemara now says, Lema b'hakam iflagi. Let us say that the machlokas Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish is as follows. The Rav Shmuel Savri, because Rav and Shmuel, they hold, like we said when we explained the Mishnah, Adam oser davar shebershuso, afilu l'chashiyetze mirashuso. A person can prohibit something that's within his rishus, and it's going to be prohibited even when it leaves his rishus. Even though during the Shemitah year, when the Shemitah year arrives, that produce is hefker, the prohibition will still be in effect. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish Savri and Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, they hold ein adam oser davar shebershuso l'chashiyetze mirashuso. A person cannot prohibit something that's in his rishus once it actually leaves his rishus. But the Gemara continues, V'tizbur, is this really logical? Me'ikol man da'amar ein adam oser davar shebereshuso l'chashiyetze mirashuso. Is there really anyone that holds that a person is not allowed to prohibit property that is in his rishus for a time when it leaves his rishus? Imkei niflagi b'nechasim elu. If that was the case, if Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish said a person is not allowed to prohibit something that even at the time that it's in his rishus for a time when it leaves his rishus, so the phrasing of the prohibition, they should have argued even in a case where the person says this property as opposed to my property. Meaning when the person says this property is prohibited, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish say it's not going to be prohibited when it leaves his rishus. And then it's obvious. Certainly Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish would say the property is permitted if he says my property, because then when it leaves his rishus, it's no longer his property. So they should have argued in a situation where the neder was phrased as nechasim elu. V'suin further, Hatanan, we learned in a Mishnah da adam oser davar shebereshuso l'chashiyetze mirashuso, that a person can prohibit something which is in his rishus even for a time when it leaves his rishus. The Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah, ha'omer livno, let's say a person says to his son, konem sha'ato nehen li, there's a konem, you can't get any benefit from me. So the halacha is mei, so if he dies, yershenu, so then he is allowed to inherit him, meaning the neder is not going to apply once the father dies. B'chayav u'v'moso, now if he says that there's a konem, he says he can't get benefit in his life, during his lifetime, and after his death. And we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Beis Amud Beis.